Welcome back to The Peak in Truth. I'm your host, Graham Mitchell, and let's get right into it. Today we have an interesting discussion between Tim Pool, host of Timcast IRL, and other political commentary shows, and Konstantin Kisin, the host of Triggernometry. A lot of interesting topics and debates that happen in this conversation here, but let's just dive right in and see what we think about it, because I, for one, have some interesting views on some of what they're saying, but I largely agree with everything that they're saying, mainly coming from Tim Pool because he lives in the United States. Konstantin, he's a really intelligent commentator, gets in the mix, tries not to go too far to the left or too far to the right, which I appreciate. But oftentimes, I feel like sometimes he can come across as a little bit of those old school liberal hairs or signals kind of showing their head. So for me, I like to get into the nuance of the discussion because I just appreciate intellectual debate and break it down and see where I find holes in the argument or where I agree or disagree. So let's just jump right in and see what they're talking about.
Is that the people of this nation agree on what is or is not acceptable. In the United States, because you had a bunch of different states of various values across a large piece of land, you had some of the founding fathers being like, no, you better write this down because I don't believe you. Here's the problem. We don't agree on what free speech is. On the extreme ends of what we would describe as the left, they say hate speech is incitement, should not be protected. In the middle, you have the free speech political absolutists, meaning don't incite crimes or violence, but express your opinions.
That's where I'm at.
Yes.
And I largely agree. But there are some philosophical challenges. And then you have the free speech absolutists that say words should never be illegal. Telling someone when or how to do something is not an action that you should be at fault for. The problem is, for those of us in the middle, what we're really arguing is that we've determined there's a moral line that should be adhered to, which provides people to communicate, but doesn't provide for crimes. The problem with that mentality, though I agree with you where we should be, that's why I believe morals actually outweigh a lot of what we think are principles. The problem with it is, if I say on paper, you can't incite someone to violence, and then all a judge needs say is, well, if you go online and say all Jews are X and deserve X, you've incited violence. And then we've determined that there is a threshold by which the law can restrict speech that the law, the government, the judges determine would or would not be incitement. The standard that we go by in the United States is creating imminent harm. So if you said, I think person should die, not illegal. If you said someone should kill person, still not illegal. If you said at this time, I want you to go and do this thing, you have now created an imminent threat and that is illegal. There still then is the argument that at some point a leftist will get in under that moral philosophy and say, well, I believe calling an entire group of people creates an incitement, and you need only a simple majority to get that codified in law, and then it happens.
Yeah, but this
is a difficult discussion here. It's an interesting one. Where's the line between free speech and oppressive government control? It's a thin line, and I think that's where people like libertarians, I can agree with a lot of what libertarians say because of their principles of freedom, small government. A lot of that aligns with like a center-right kind of conservative, but not necessarily extreme religious conservative view in totality. I can agree with a lot of those things, but I think where they go wrong is that you do need some sort of foundational framework, whether it's a moral framework or some sort of guideline that people can adhere to. A lot of places that maybe don't have that, what they do have, something the United States used to have, was cultural cohesion, right? Even though we had different cultures, there was like a value and a moral system that the United States culture in general, not subconsciously, but silently adhered to and agreed to. So we didn't step outside the bounds of some of these norms, even though they weren't necessarily laws. And then that free speech, freedom, open prairie type vibe was not as threatening or wasn't being exploited, essentially. But nowadays, it raises a lot of questions, whether it's with the internet or what have you, that where libertarians want no speech, no free speech absolutist. They want no guidelines or barriers or anything to free speech. And I understand, because the last thing I want is the government stepping in and telling people what they can and can't say. Because once you give the government power, they will logically, inevitably abuse that power and expand that power, and you don't get it back. And speech is the foundation of freedom in general. I mean, the only thing more foundational than speech is thinking. And, that'll come next with technology. So you want to protect free speech at all costs. That's why it's the First Amendment. That's why the founding fathers put it in there. However, just like people have the right to do whatever they want to do, but they can't do whatever they want to do if it inflicts on other people's rights, right? That's the same way I view free speech. So it gets muddy, because where is that line? Where is that line? And there, to be honest, there really is no perfect, agreement we can come to of where that is, because that's a subjective line. I like to have my bar be very low. I'm perfectly fine with being offended by all different types of things. I don't have to like what you're saying, none of that. Like, I believe that we should keep that bar absolutely as low as possible, as close to absolute free speech as possible. But I do acknowledge that we cannot have absolute free speech. We already don't have it. You can't incite violence. You can't defame people. There's plenty of things you can't do in terms of free speech. But now that we have the internet and all these different means of communication and connectivity, and there's new threats, we don't want to take the freedom of speech away on the internet, but we do have to consider what our argument is, because they're going to make their argument. The government and these big businesses and these big tech companies, they're going to make their argument for why certain types of speech is or isn't allowed. And if we want to oppose that, just throwing your hands up and saying absolute free speech is not a valid argument. I'm just letting you know. I'm on your side, but I'm on your side in a way that's actually feasible, a way that we can actually win the argument, because free speech absolutism is not a winning argument. I'm sorry. There's too many logical examples that I could come up with, or anybody could come up with, even current ones, that could prove that that's, one, not already allowed, and two, not conducive to a functional society whatsoever. So if you really want to maintain your rights, you have to have a good argument. So let's keep going.
This is why we shouldn't. I think the problem has been is that people argue about these things in slogans, and there's a lot of sloganeering about. Actually, there's never going to be any clarity. It's always going to be up to some debate, unless you say anyone should be able to say anything, which I think ignores the reality of the interconnected world we live in. And somebody could send out a tweet, and if their platform is large and if enough people, that could cause real world harm, and that's a fact.
And now you're talking about morality-based laws versus principle-based laws. You are arguing that a society should be society's laws should be predicated upon what a moral person of your morality should believe. If we were principles-based, we'd say you can say anything, words are not crime. But we are a moral-based people. We actually determine at some point laws should or should not apply based on our personal morality. We have things called blue laws, for instance, which is laws that were passed that were deemed to blaspheme or to violate Christian tenets. We don't really enforce a lot of these that much anymore, but in Virginia, for instance, you can't sell cars on Sundays. There are certain laws like you can't have a bath on Tuesdays in Boston. I don't know if it's exactly that, but you get the point. Nobody's going to enforce that because it no longer aligns with our morality. So in this case, what's the point of writing the law down if the police do or do not enforce certain things based on what our personal morals are? The Constitution ends up becoming meaningless when you start to look at where we are with a morally divergent society. You have those of the Christian moral tradition. Some are secular, but still adhere to a Christian moral tradition. And then you have the new, I would refer to Peter Boghossian's non-theistic religion of intersectionality or wokeness. Their moral traditions and moral foundation is a mirror image to the Christian or classically liberal moral tradition. The laws invert themselves in this regard. For example, the question I often ask people, do you believe that a parent should have final say as to the medical decisions of their child? Yes or no?
Yes.
So, no.
Yep. No. Okay, so
For instance, if a child is going to die because they can't receive a blood transfusion and the parent is Jehovah's Witness, and it's a matter of life or death, like, yep, that. The child gets a blood transfusion.
I hadn't considered that.
So you've now set the precedent, right?
Yeah.
In court, if a doctor deems life-saving treatment is necessary, the parents must be overruled,
It's
correct?
very easy to get from there to trans.
Yeah.
I see what
Yeah,
you're
Exactly,
yeah.
which is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Under the exact same principle espoused by both,
Yeah.
you have conservatives saying we should not allow the state. So you have in Florida, the state should not be allowed to decide for the parents what is right for their children. Trans is out. In California, the life of the child is paramount. The courts must decide. But this also lends itself to another scenario, vaccination and mandated vaccines. So, and abortion, for instance. Depending on what your morality is, your view of whether or not a person has a right to decide for their child changes. Most conservatives would say, I don't think, I say the parent has the final say. Another question for you. Okay, so it's you said yes, you said no.
Yeah, but this is
now
before you get into it, this is the point I was going to make. I actually hadn't considered the Jehovah's Witness.
I'm going to change your mind. I'm going to change both of your minds right now.
Well,
So you go to California,
yeah.
and the parents say, my child is depressed. They go to the doctor. The doctor says, your child is just being a teenager. They're suffering from a depression. It's an episode. They'll be fine. And they say, doctor, no, my child is trans and I want the surgery. And the doctor says, I'm not going to I disagree. I refuse to do this. Should the parents be allowed to get transgender surgery for their child if they're seeking active affirmation from a doctor?
This is the point I was going to make, which is the reason we litigate all of this stuff to the extent that we do is there are not going to be easy answers. You could go down this route or that route, which is why I've always been very persuaded by the argument that the government should be as close to the people as possible because people can then opt into a community that shares their values. This is one of the great things about this country, right?
The point I'm making is that your principle is completely meaningless. It adheres only to the moral structure of the community.
Yeah.
If you go to a liberal and say a doctor is denying life-saving gender treatment the parents are begging for,
Yeah.
if you go to a conservative, should the state intervene to save a child from parents who are going to transit? They say yes. Should the state intervene to stop, to protect a child if the parents won't let it get trans? Right? The views are inverted on both sides based on morals, not principles.
So what's your point?
We don't live in a principles-based society. We live in a morals-based society. And if you argue that we have free speech, it stops where your moral line stops and you don't actually believe in free speech.
And what's your point from that?
That we have a large faction of people in this country, namely when we're talking about free speech or you say that it's enshrined in our public, we don't. We don't have free speech. We have certain moral lines that entertain when it is or is not acceptable to say certain words, and then we protect ourselves from feeling bad about what we think is wrong by claiming we're for free speech.
Bingo. And that's what I was talking about. You see, with all the nuance that goes into the free speech discussion, people forget about morals. And one of the main problems that I think we're having in America in the last 10, 15 years or so, primarily, is that we've completely abandoned religion. Now, I'm not a religious person. My mother's Jewish, my father's Jamaican, so maybe Catholic, Christian, but they don't really pay attention to religion like that in that culture. So it's very different, but definitely not Jewish or anything like that. So two completely, opposed ideologies, so to speak. And so I grew up with like more of a balanced view on religion in general and didn't really value it in that way. Now that I've gotten older and paid attention to the degradation of society and what's going on specifically on the liberal side of things, where I also pretty much grew up on, I've noticed that if you study philosophy, you study history, other cultures, other countries currently, really what's going on all across the West is abandoning religion. Sounds like a nice idea intellectually. Like, oh, well, if we don't believe in this specific book or that specific ideology, because in America specifically, we, don't build our culture essentially off of one religion, right? We have the freedom of religion. Many countries don't. So because of that fact, we don't really need religion as the foundation for morality. The argument that we always used to make and that liberals still make to this day is that only bad people, quote unquote, need religion to keep them centered in some form of morality or virtuosity, whereas they think that people are born with the understanding that killing others is bad and stealing others is bad and hurting other people is bad. And to some degree, I would say, sure, that's true. But just because some people are born, with good parents, and actually, I could make a strong argument that that's completely not true, right? You see little kids, infants, toddlers hit each other, kick each other, even siblings. And the parents are the ones that have to tell them, don't do that. That's wrong. Kids will push others off of playground things and every kid has different personality types. They have different dispositions. So it's kind of ridiculous to assume that people just come out of the womb and they just know right from wrong. But what's more important is not whether they know right from wrong. It's about, you don't build a society, a functioning society where everybody's protected. You don't build that off a foundation of everybody just kind of knows what's right from wrong and we just trust them to know what's right from wrong. That's a recipe for disaster. That's what liberalism is, and that's what it's become. Without any sort of societal agreement on morality, guess what morality that society has? None. It has no morality. Because if I don't have a foundational sense of morality, I can't tell you why yours is wrong. That's it. That's where the debate stops. Like I told you, I like to think about things from a logical and reasonable perspective. And that logic is irrefutable. If you don't have a centered, strong moral framework that you're operating by, you can operate by that all you want. You can do that all you want, and you can still come to good conclusions. That's true. But when somebody else comes to different conclusions, you have no basis to tell them why they're wrong. You just don't, because you don't have a centered moral framework. It's just because you say so, or because you feel that way, or because it just should be that way. But that's not a strong argument. It's not an argument at all. It's a losing argument. And so then what happens is the people who can either manipulate or exploit that, whether it's psychopathic people or people with other types of mental conditions or just opportunistic people, narcissists, whatever, they will push that boundary. And then you can't tell them why their new boundaries are wrong because you believe in free speech absolutism and you can do whatever you want as long as you're not harming anybody, quote unquote. And then the bar just keeps getting raised. It just keeps getting raised. And then we end up here where we're chopping off the genitals of kids and giving them puberty blockers and having fully bearded men walking around with skirts demanding that they be called women and claiming that they're having their periods. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. And that's what this conversation right here is exposing. It's a really good conversation, and it's devolving, or it's breaking down into the minutia of what really happens once you pick apart these discussions. And in terms of morality, that's where the United States is, and that's where I think we've fallen. The West in general, we have to, it's actually a fallacy that the Constitution and the Founding Fathers didn't consider religion when they were drafting the document. Almost all of them had some sort of religious Christian framework, and they wrote a lot of that in the Constitution. I mean, the references to God, all men are created equal under God. We used to say the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. This was a foundational principle of the United States. The freedom of religion wasn't meant that there should be no religion whatsoever, because as I said, almost all the original colonies were Christian to one degree or another, or some sort of religious fundamentalism or something like that. But what is true is that the argument about religion and the constitutional amendment about, no state or no government body shall infringe upon another state's religion or force them to practice a certain religion. That's not about saying that you can't, the federal government can't say that the Constitution is founded under, Christian ethics. That's not what that means. It means that if Florida is predominantly Catholic and New York is predominantly Christian and has a 30% or 20% Jewish population and a 10% Muslim, the Christians in New York can't force the Christians in Florida to convert to their side of Christianity. They can't force them to change their religion. But that has nothing to do with the discussion that all of that is saying that we do accept that morality comes from religion. That's why we're giving people the freedom to practice their form of religion, because we value religion, right? It was not an atheist country or an agnostic country or anything like that, because that doesn't work. Unless you want the government to have absolute power and then you worship the government as the deity, then you'll end up with complete authoritarian fascism and or communism, which I would argue is roughly the same thing. So if we bring back, or if we just allow ourselves to accept that we need a foundational or fundamental agreement of what is morality, aka Christian ethics, which is where our morality came from in the modern Western culture, period. If we're just being honest, that's where it comes from. And all these fancy liberals like Bill Maher or whatever who try to make the argument otherwise. Yeah, I loved Religious. It was a great movie, but it's not accurate. Okay, that's where our morality comes from, Christian ethics, and it's a better society if it does, because while we won't use the Bible to legislate, we can agree on the fundamental principles stated therein. Like murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, divorce is bad, cheating on your spouse is bad, like bad in the sense of like condemned, right? Chopping off the genitals of a boy, that would be bad. Sterilizing a woman, that would be bad. So, complaining that because the Bible isn't perfect and so therefore we can't use it is just as stupid as saying, well, the Constitution had flaws in it too, so we should just throw that out the window. It's a dumb, low IQ, low resolution, lazy argument.
For instance, in public and scream racial slurs, sure, you have free speech, but you'll be canceled. But the left has a much lighter threshold than the right. The right claims we're for free speech, until it comes to the issue of Israel. And now all of a sudden you're going to deport people and shut them down because, as the Department of Justice said, this activist's words aligned with Hamas. Aligned with. Now, I follow the law. And if you want to change the law, change the law. The Secretary of State has the right to rescind a visa and deport somebody. But let's be real. There are so many people who argue you are being anti-Semitic on campus and we shouldn't allow it, that claim they were free speech until it met their moral line. And they said, but that one doesn't count. And I'm not trying to disparage those people for believing that. I'm simply pointing out everyone's going to argue my principles direct me. No, your moral community.
I don't think it's everyone. Like for me, for example, in that particular instance, I think there are two things that I would say. The first one is, unless someone's been convicted of a crime, I don't consider them a criminal, usually. Now, there are exceptions to this, people who are blatantly got away with it or whatever. But in this guy's case, I don't think there's any clear evidence that he's like a terrorist, terrorist supporter, even though I'm sure he is, right?
But this doesn't pertain to law.
How do you mean?
Under the Immigration and Naturalization Act.
I know.
You don't need to be a criminal.
I understand that. But what I'm saying is, for me, as someone who thinks free speech is important, but also doesn't like Hamas supporters, I would probably err on the side of this guy being allowed to stay in if I was an American citizen, on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm not an American citizen. And when I come here, I don't go around starting protests because it's kind of a douchey thing to do. Like, if you let me in your house, I'm probably going to behave in a slightly different way than I would in my own house, right? So, and Francis and I, when we visit the United States, we are respectful to the fact that it's not our country. There are certain things that we may legally be entitled to do here that we wouldn't do, because when you are an immigrant or a visitor to a country, you need to behave in a way that's not just in accordance with the law, but you have an added responsibility, basically not to be a dick.
I agree. So the issue is when it comes to the principles versus morals. If you believe in free speech, when do you stop? Where is your line? And the point is, free speech in its purest form is absolutism. You can say whatever you want. Do you believe all people have a right to free speech? Well, now you're going to find a mix of morals on the right. Many on the right are going to say, yeah, but only for American citizens. I never meant for non-citizens to come here and speak against our country. And they're being honest. They never did.
Yeah.
There was a period where we all agreed What the left is doing with big tech is violating our free speech. Of course, to be honest, the left then conflates the First Amendment with free speech, which are two completely different things. But then when it comes to the issue of should we deport a green card holder, temporary green card holder, because of his speech, a lot of people are going to say, well, yeah, absolutely. To be fair, he organized protests that took over buildings and threatened staff and caused fights and led to violence. So I have no problem with that guy being deported. I just think that you get these anti-Semitism bills that are getting passed where like universities can't allocate funds or allow for certain protests. Otherwise, we'll pull funding. It goes against American foreign policy. And I'm like, I have no problem with you doing it. I see that's where your morals lie. I just like to point out to everybody who claims they support free speech, I bet I can find a point at which you will say that's not free speech. So for like Myron Gaines, for instance, said, I'm for free speech. And I said, what about porn? No, porn's not free speech. Okay, well, the woman on the show who was an OnlyFans creator said, absolutely it is. It is my expression. It is my views. And it's age-gated and costs money. Why can't I do it? Two different complete moral lines on whether one thing is free speech or not. So I bring this up because where we are right now in this country, you have Donald Trump trying to engage in actions which are largely popular, maybe depending on, it's tough. He's for the first time in 20 years, the country is on the right track or to the highest degree. I mean, single polls don't mean much to me, but we're seeing some form of this, despite the fact that people kind of don't approve of Donald Trump. His aggregate approval ratings are in the margin of error, which is really good for him, by the way. But a lot of what he does is popular. You have people now knowing when we should or should not obey judges. On the left, the liberals, liberal is a colloquial term in the United States for the left faction, doesn't really mean liberal. They are willing to imprison lawyers. They are willing to cheer for violence, engage in violence. They have, in many instances, more than the right, murdered people. And that's in line with their morality. When it now comes to Trump and the right having power to use, Republicans are often mocked for refusing to use it. We could expel Democrats from Congress right now. Al Green, for not only was he to be censured for interrupting the not so State of the Union, but when he was being censured, he, along with many other Democrats, blocked the proceedings and obstructed it, and Johnson simply adjourned. Should we not use power to the degree that they have used? But it's against our principles. Is it? Our moral world is being crushed by these people. Do we decide today we will defend our moral worldview and traditions by any means necessary? Or will we keep saying that we afford our enemies special privileges they do not afford us? My view is that, I'll say 10 years ago, I was free speech for everyone, even if we don't agree. I don't agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And then they bludgeoned me over the head with it and tried to destroy my life. And I said, that was stupid of me. Free speech is for those that live within the confines of our moral community. If you are an individual who's a communist and you stand up for free speech at every turn, you reject violence and say, one day I hope we achieve communism, I would say, well, I think your idea is dumb, but if they ever come to censor you, I got your back. Most communists, however, celebrate your demise and advocate it and try to make it happen. In which case I say, why would I award them quarter? My view is we have rights in the United States. We protect the rights of those in the United States, even if they're not citizens. There's a varying degree of how much you will be protected and what your due process, what process you are actually due. We don't extend that to jihadis or ISIS or Soleimani. So if you are Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, a 16-year-old American citizen, and you're eating dinner in Yemen, Barack Obama has no right to murder you, which he did. And this is, in my view, because he was the son of Anwar al-Awlaki, a terrorist. I think the message Obama was trying to send to the world is that if you speak against us, we'll murder your children. Anwar al-Awlaki was a jihadi. He was an American, though. He was in a foreign country. I believe he was in Yemen. Barack Obama had no right to murder him. American citizens are afforded protections anywhere they are in the world. You can't just murder Americans. Here's where things get tricky. What if that American is running towards American troops with a machine gun? Okay, well, that's self-defense. Like, we understand, you could be in America. Obama ordered a drone strike to kill a guy, arguing he's an enemy combatant. He doesn't deserve trial. No, he has to get trial. So the issue I see is we don't extend the same rights to our enemy combatants and adversaries around the world. Why would we do the same? Why would we do the inverse for the domestic enemy?
And so this is where I'll stop it right there, and I'll let you think about that. Leave a comment if you feel like Tim overstepped the bounds, or maybe if you feel like he didn't go far enough in terms of his defense of free speech or his explanation as to what constitutes free speech or what constitutes a justifiable reason to draw a line where free speech ends, basically. Tell me what you think. I'm really curious because, as I said, this is a complicated issue. I know where I stand, and my stance is about the nuance. So, for instance, people who are upset about the case that they were talking about, which is the kid on the college campus that advocated for the Hamas. I don't care to get into the debate, but there is evidence that he was part of a group that 100% supported Hamas. You know, however you feel about that war, that's the facts. And he was a visa holder, and so he technically has the right. The Secretary of State does have the right to revoke the visa and thus deport him. Period. End of story. We could agree, disagree, but it's not a violation of a right. As far as should, anti-Semitic or what people deem anti-Semitic speech be deemed hate speech and allowed to be censored, I completely disagree with that. 100%. Even though I got Jewish in my blood, that doesn't matter to me. As I said, if you're gonna have a moral stance, then you have to be consistent. And so I don't believe in violating people's free speech just because this time it offended you and you're afraid of it. No. However, as somebody who's a proud American, whose family, grandparents fought in both world wars for this country, I'm proud of the rights that they fought and many people died for to uphold for us. And it's our job to carry that water. And so when I see people burning the American flag in public, criticize America all you want. I'm not a fan of burning the American flag. I think that should be a crime. I honestly do. You have the right. First of all, it is a crime because arson is a crime and setting fires in public is a crime. So if you're burning flags of any kind, but particularly the American flag, because this is America, there needs to be a boundary that says that that's not okay, right? That's number one. Number two, if you're advocating for some sort of war in a foreign country, or if America is involved in any sort of direct or indirect conflict in a foreign country, and you're not an American citizen, and then you're running around in the street burning flags, you can get the fuck out. I'm sorry, right away. And I couldn't care less, because this is America. If you don't stand for anything, you'll fall. If you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. That was my George Bush moment right there. But seriously, and if we don't protect our values and our rights and our way of living for American citizens, or people who are trying to become American citizens but are doing it in a way where they respect our culture and our tradition, if we don't do that, our country will literally disintegrate into chaos or just be overrun or overtaken. And I'm sorry, that's just the facts. That's the peak in truth. And I'll see you next time to give you more raw, unfiltered, unfettered opinion and fact-based commenting on what's going on out there in the streets. Until then, have a good weekend. Take care.